Well, in terms of its placement and form, the Australian War Memorial is one of the most striking buildings in Canberra. Standing opposite and on the same axis as Parliament House, and with its domed basilica-like shape, the memorial reads like a secular cathedral. We might be standing on the site of the never-built Anglican cathedral, but really we were gazumped already. Its religious overtones are reinforced by its sanctuary-like hall of memory, complete with stained glass windows, and the stone of remembrance that stands in front of the building, inscribed with the words, "Their name liveth for evermore." It is impossible not to interpret this large white stone slab as anything other than an altar. This photo is from 1946, the first Remembrance Day service that used this installation. The sacrificial resonances are absolutely intentional. The memorial and its associated ceremonies would be worthy of an analysis in the light of the work of René Girard on sacrifice. This evening, however, I want to focus on a group of works by Australian painter Ben Quilty, commissioned by the War Memorial. Quilty's drawings and paintings were exhibited in the memorial for a period of 6 months, from December 2014 to June 2015, and subsequently toured to Darwin, Townsville, and Castlemaine. This exhibition, in quite an extraordinary way, offered a reading of sacrifice that is in stark contrast to the clean, polished, altar-like stone of remembrance. I was inspired to see the Ben Quilty after Afghanistan paintings because driving up Anzac Parade, I saw a large banner on the front of the memorial building containing this image and advertising the exhibition. When I saw it, I'd actually felt uncomfortable, as if something had been misplaced. The clean lines of the Australian War Memorial and its sacred and sacrificial overtones have somehow hidden the reality that it memorialises. Placing a portrait of a youthful but vulnerable soldier, partly eclipsed by a dark hole, on the outside of the building seemed like the equivalent of stripping naked in public. Naming so publicly, if symbolically, the darkness that is carried home by soldiers seemed risky to me. It disrupted the narrative of heroic sacrifice. In 2011, Ben Quilty spent a month in Afghanistan as an official war artist. During that period, he spent time with Australians deployed in Kabul, Kandahar, and Tarankot in Afghanistan, and at Al Minhad Air Base in the United Arab Emirates. His task was to record and interpret the experiences of Australian servicemen and women. But for Quilty, this short tour of a war zone simply marked the beginning of something more significant, the beginning of friendships, of listening to, and of exploring more deeply the impact of war on these defence personnel. On his return, Quilty found painting from the sketches and photographs that he brought back with him inadequate for completing the task of recording and interpreting the soldiers' war experience. They failed to capture the immediacy that he had experienced when meeting the soldiers. So he began inviting some of them to his studio. He said, "I asked them not only to tell me more of the stories, but also to suggest a pose that encapsulated some of their feelings of the emotion that surrounded their experience in Afghanistan." Quilty also asked them to pose naked. With a highly attuned emotional intelligence, Quilty reveals both the strength and vulnerability of these soldiers, mostly from the elite Special Operations Task Group. In the resulting portraits, we see the cost of war imprinted on naked flesh. For the soldiers themselves, Quilty's portraits often revealed the suppressed and residual emotions that they had necessarily been unable to acknowledge during their deployment, so that sitting for Quilty became therapeutic. The therapeutic nature of Quilty's process is evident in a series of portraits of retired Air Commodore John Oddie. Oddie was deployed in 2011 as Deputy Commander of the Joint Task Forces in the Middle East, responsible for about 2,500 service people with a special focus on Afghanistan. These 3 portraits were painted over a period of 5 months after Oddie's return from deployment. Oddie described the experience of having his portrait painted as cathartic. I quote his own words now from the Australian Story interviews by the ABC, this first portrait. He says, "The first picture he did of me was shortly after I came back from over there. I was still tired, and still, even now, I carry some of the weight of the moment." Second portrait. "You know, going back into a tough environment, that you're going to take a bit more damage on board. You're going to have another layer of life experience. But in doing so, you also think, well, I'll put those ideas in a box and hide them from myself. And I thought that Ben wouldn't see any of this. Well, Ben is a remarkably astute man, there's no doubt about that. And he saw years of circumstance, I guess." Third portrait. "In a human sense, I had to actually accept the fact that there's an apparent truth there. I wasn't always admitting the truth to myself about my life, and so he really took that out and put it on a table in front of me like a 3-course dinner and said, 'Well, how about that?' And you know, I sort of thought, well, I'm not going to come to this restaurant again in a hurry." You're naturally going to feel it in your heart. You're going to feel it right there, and you'll carry that with you. You can't go back and not be that person when you leave. You are that person. You take it on, and many of us take that forward. So Ben sees that in us. In the 2012 ABC interview, Oddie goes on to describe a particular moment that he believes he will always carry with him. "On my birthday last year, I had to preside over the memorial service whereby we farewelled Sapper Rowan Robinson back to Australia, to the arms of his family. My birthday every year will be that commemoration service." At this point in the interview, he cries. "I can't let go of that. It's a remarkable experience to have on your birthday. It's the one anniversary of every year. You can't let go of it. Other times I've had bad moments, but they don't come connected to that particular perspective, and it sits with you forever. But that's life, and you've got to tough it out to some extent." I wonder how Oddie will carry this and other moments into the rest of his life, and in particular into his old age. As part of my work for the Centre for Ageing and Pastoral Studies during 2013 and 14, I was involved in the testing of a pastoral care and music intervention with residents in an aged care facility who'd had a diagnosis of dementia and depression. The fundamental premise of the intervention was that people with dementia retain capacities that we commonly underrate, and that we consequently deprive people in this situation of opportunities to engage in meaningful activity and especially to make meaning in their lives. Over a 12-week period, a small group of residents met for music listening and conversation around a series of themes including gratitude, peace, forgiveness, hope, joy and faith. Pastoral care staff or volunteers facilitated these groups. As I reviewed the transcripts for one of the testing sites for this intervention, I was struck by the contribution of one male participant. Each week, Ian would begin to tell a story which appeared to allude to a war experience. Each week, the group facilitator would either move the conversation back to what she deemed to be its proper focus, or endeavour to put a positive spin on the story. I found myself both frustrated by the facilitator's repeated failure to help the man tell the story that was clearly troubling him, and haunted by the fact that a traumatic memory stretching back more than 70 years continued to disturb his being. Are veterans destined to battle to the end with the legacy of war and violence? During the 1970s and 80s, there was a wave of enthusiasm for reminiscence work, particularly in groups in aged care settings. This work built on the thinking of Erik Erikson on the developmental tasks of life stages and the work of Robert Butler on life review. Since the 1990s, however, a more cautious attitude to reminiscence work has generally prevailed, acknowledging the emotional power of the past and the danger of underestimating the lasting effects of traumatic memory. Individuals deal with traumatic war memories in different ways. Working with First World War veterans during the 1970s, gerontologist Peter Coleman found veterans successfully, in inverted commas, integrating memories which remained emotionally charged after 50 years into personal stories which transcended received accounts of war. Others chose to leave these memories undisturbed. Traumatic memory, however, may re-emerge unbidden. There is evidence that events that lower personal control, such as an accident or the sudden death of a spouse or friends, markedly increase the risk of intrusive memories, especially in the later years. Dementia is one such event where personal agency is particularly threatened. For veterans who, for whatever reason, have been unable to adequately process their traumatic memories, the inevitable physical, social, and cognitive decrements of ageing can make them vulnerable to those unresolved memories. A further point made by Coleman is pertinent. He suggests that a further danger is that reminiscence group work may attempt to reinforce stereotyped accounts of major events. There can be a gap between societal myths, the stories we tell ourselves as a community, and the individual's traumatic memory, so that individual experiences and interpretations are rendered invalid. Some stories are silenced by a reluctance to hear them or because they do not fit the myth. What theological resources can we bring to this situation? Tonight I have time only to offer some initial thoughts. First, it seems to me that as Christians we ought to be in the business of truth-telling. We are part of a long tradition of prophetic saying, of speaking truth to power, as the Quakers put it. So we need to hear these uncomfortable memories and advocate for the damaged over the long haul. Second, ours is an incarnational faith. We believe that God became human in the person of Jesus, that salvation has to do with bodily life, that history is not just something to be endured, but the very location of God's redemptive work. The bodies that carry traumatic memories are sacred ground, where God's Spirit is groaning in travail, longing to heal and recreate. Our theology of the cross will, of course, have important things to say to this situation. The images of suffering carried by the subjects of Ben Quilty's work resonate with images of the crucifixion. Yet we are also Easter people, proclaiming in the resurrection of Jesus the victory of life over death, good over evil, joy over tears. How can this be so in the face of the persistence of trauma in our bodies. I wonder if the Gospel of John might help us here with the insistence of Thomas on touching the wounds of the risen Christ. "Unless I see the marks of the nails in his hands," he said, "and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe." In medieval Catholicism, the sacred wounds of Christ became a focus of religious devotion. Some of this devotion was undoubtedly unhealthy, but I wonder if we might find there some theological resources to help us think fruitfully and theologically about traumatic memory. A project for the future, perhaps. Let me leave you with a final work of art. Coventry in England was badly bombed during the Second World War, and the medieval cathedral was left in ruins. The new Coventry Cathedral, commenced in 1956 and consecrated in 1962, became a significant symbol of healing and reconciliation in post-World War II Britain. Alongside the new cathedral, the ruins of the medieval cathedral were retained. The work of reconciliation is still central to the cathedral, and in 2011, those ruins of the old cathedral were designated as a memorial to all civilians killed, injured, or traumatised by war and violent conflict. Inside the cathedral, it is no coincidence that the Christ in glory depicted in Graham Sutherland's tapestry, created for the sanctuary of the new cathedral, bears the wounds of the crucifixion. This is the resurrected, ascended Christ, eternally bearing the wounds of trauma. In the embrace of this Christ, the wounded healer, our memories of war and trauma are held with dignity and compassion.